Elsie's fingers trembled violently as she pressed her mother's wedding ring against her palm and the thin gold band slippery with the cold sweat of desperation. Wind shrieked through Dead Crow's Hollow's crumbling buildings like the cries of the damned, carrying with it the stench of despair that clung to every board and stone. Behind her, 8-year-old Clara's breath came in sharp, visible gasps, her hollow cheeks blue-tinged from more than just the October cold. "Please, mister," Elsie whispered when Murphy's saloon's back door cracked open, revealing Jake Murphy's beard matted with tobacco stains and cruelty. "It was our mama's, real gold. We just need bread anything." The words hung in the frigid air, like prayers offered to a deaf god. Clara's small body shook against her sister's, and Elsie could feel each of her ribs through the threadbare fabric of her dress. Jake's bloodshot eyes fixed on the ring with the hunger of a vulture. Without warning, his meaty hand shot out, fingers closing around the precious circle with practiced greed. No charity for beggar rats. He snarled and shoved both girls hard into the October mud. The impact drove ice-cold sludge into Elsie's mouth, up her nose, soaking through every layer of their pitiful clothing. Clara's cry of pain and shock pierced the night as they tumbled backward, their last treasure vanishing behind the slamming door like hope being strangled. From the shadows between two weather-beaten buildings, Chaza watched the scene with the stillness of death itself. The Lakota warrior's scarred hands slowly clenched into fists, so tight his knuckles went white, memories clawing at his chest like physical wounds. Another child's face flashed before his eyes. Winona, his 7-year-old daughter, wide with terror as cavalry bullets found their mark. The two small figures in the mud didn't move for a long time, too broken even for tears. In their desperate embrace, he saw his own failure reflected back sharp as the knife that had carved the scar across his left palm, deep as the grave where his child lay cold. Dead Crow's Hollow squatted in the Dakota Territory like a diseased animal, its ramshackle buildings housing 300 souls who'd come west to escape judgment or find fortune. The town's heartbeat was the steady thump of mining hammers, its lifeblood the gold that flowed through Silas Greer's iron fingers. "We remember who we are." 10-year-old Elsie Murphy whispered to her sister 6 months ago, standing beside their parents' graves. Around them, weathered headstones bore the names of other miners. Carved into the memorial wall was their father's name, among dozens of others, a tradition meant to honor the dead, but now serving as a grim reminder of how easily lives could be erased. But remembering grew harder each day. Their Irish father, Seamus, had possessed a gift for reading rock formations, that Elsie had inherited a skill that let him find gold where others saw only stone. He'd discovered something in his mine shaft before Greer cheated him with forged documents. Their mother, Bridget, had died 3 weeks after Seamus, her heart giving out after watching her husband cough blood from his accident. Clara had their mother's gentleness, but also an uncanny ability to slip through shadows unseen. Together, the sisters had survived 6 months of cruelty in a town that treated orphans like curses made flesh. Those girls carry death with them, Mrs. Kellerman would mutter, crossing herself when she saw them. "Mark my words, nothing good comes from children who linger where they don't belong." Maureen O'Brien, the Irish widow who ran the town's boarding house, sometimes left bread where they could find it. Her own boy had died of fever the previous winter, leaving her with empty rooms and a heart that recognized kindred suffering. "They're just children, for Christ's sake," she'd snapped at Samuel the blacksmith when he complained about their presence. "Children or not, they're bad luck." Samuel had replied, but something in his tone suggested discomfort rather than conviction. In the town's margins moved Chaza, carrying ghosts that whispered in his daughter's voice. He worked odd jobs with steady hands and watchful eyes, his knowledge of the land proving valuable for tracking lost livestock or reading weather signs. Most people barely noticed him exactly as he preferred. Maureen had found him bleeding in her barn 8 months ago, more dead than alive. "What brings a man to my door in such condition?" she'd asked while cleaning wounds that spoke of violence and pursuit. "The hope that tomorrow might hurt less than today," he'd replied. She'd asked no more questions, understanding that some wounds were too deep for words. But tonight, watching those two small figures struggle from the mud behind Murphy's saloon, Chaza felt something crack inside his chest, like ice breaking on a spring river. In Elsie's defiant chin and Clara's trusting grip on her sister's hand, he saw echoes of the daughter he'd failed to save. The warrior who'd lost everything made a choice that would change all their fates. Dawn broke gray and merciless over Dead Crow's Hollow, finding the sisters huddled against Brennan's general store like abandoned kittens. They'd spent the night shivering beneath torn canvas, their stomachs cramping with the familiar agony of starvation. "I'm sorry about Mama's ring." Clara whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind that rattled loose shutters like skeleton fingers. Elsie pulled her sister closer, though she had little warmth to offer. "Wasn't your fault, love? Those men got the devil's own darkness in them." Morning bustle began around them miners, heading to their claims, merchants unlocking shops with keys that rang like funeral bells in the cold air. Most people stepped around the girls as if poverty were contagious, but Mrs. Kellerman finally stopped her baker's apron, already dusted with flour. "You two can't sit here like beggars," she declared, voice sharp with embarrassment rather than true anger. "It's bad for business having children starving on doorsteps." "We're not beggars," Elsie said quietly, but steel threaded her voice like wire through silk. "We're just resting. Resting for 6 months now. High time someone did something proper about you both." Mrs. Kellerman marched toward the saloon with the determined stride of someone avoiding their own conscience. Within minutes, she returned with Jake Murphy trailing behind her, and behind him, a man whose very presence seemed to drain warmth from the morning air. Silas Greer stood tall as a gallows pole, his shoulders broad enough to block doorways, and his pale blue eyes missing nothing. When he walked Dead Crow's Hollow streets, even grown men stepped aside like water parting before a ship's prow. "Well now," Greer said, his voice carrying the deceptive softness of snow before an avalanche. "If it isn't the Murphy orphans. Jake here tells me you tried selling him stolen goods last night." "That's a filthy lie." Elsie leapt to her feet, small fists clenched. "That ring belonged to our mama. Her own mother gave it to her." Greer's smile was thin as a razor's edge. "Strong words from such a little thing. But Jake's a respected man in this community, and you—" His gaze flicked over their ragged appearance with theatrical disgust. "You're just mouths nobody wants to feed. Who do you think folks will believe?" Clara pressed against her sister's side, her 8-year-old instincts sensing danger the way small animals sense approaching storms. Around them, a crowd had gathered not to help, but to witness whatever spectacle was about to unfold. "I've got witnesses." Greer continued, gesturing toward Jake and Mrs. Kellerman like a prosecutor presenting evidence. "Saw you trying to fence stolen property with my own eyes. That's a hanging offense in most civilized places." "You're lying through your teeth," Elsie said, but her voice cracked with the first threads of real fear. "Maybe I am." Greer's tone grew almost conversational. But lies told by important men carry considerably more weight than truth from orphan brats whose daddy was nothing but a common thief. The words hit Elsie like a physical blow. Her father a thief, but before she could protest, Greer knelt down until his face was level with hers, and she could smell whiskey and malice on his breath. "Lucky for you, I'm feeling charitable this fine morning. Instead of a rope around those scrawny necks, I'll make sure you're placed with good Christian families who'll teach you proper behavior and honest work." Something in Greer's tone made Elsie's skin crawl like insects were walking across her bones. She'd heard whispers children who left Dead Crow's Hollow with strangers and were never seen again, vanishing into the vast wilderness as if they'd never existed at all. "We don't need any families," she said desperately. "We take care of ourselves just fine." "Not anymore, you don't." Greer straightened to his full intimidating height and nodded toward Jake. "Take them to the old stable. Keep them comfortable until proper arrangements can be made. Jake's hands descended toward them, like the talons of some great predatory bird, but Elsie was quicker. She grabbed Clara's wrist and bolted toward the nearest alley, her sister's feet barely touching the ground as they ran. Behind them, angry shouts erupted. "Stop them! Don't let the little thieves escape." But Elsie knew every hiding place in Dead Crow's Hollow, every loose board, every shadowed corner, every gap between buildings, where a desperate child might squeeze through to safety. She pulled Clara through a break in Brennan's fence, across the muddy wasteland behind Samuel's smithy, and into the maze of abandoned mining equipment that littered the camp's eastern edge, like the bones of dead giants. They crouched behind a broken ore cart, both breathing hard, their hearts hammering against their ribs like caged birds desperate for freedom. "What do we do now?" Clara whispered, her dark eyes wide with terror. Elsie's mind raced through possibilities, each one bleaker than the last. They couldn't hide forever in a camp at this small. Greer's men would find them within hours, and the punishment for running would be far worse than simple capture. But she knew with bone-deep certainty that whatever Greer had planned was darker than any punishment she could imagine. "We run tonight when it's full dark," she decided. "Head for the hills and make our own way somehow." Clara nodded, trusting her sister's judgment as she always had. Neither girl noticed the shadow that moved with purpose between the rusted mining equipment or the dark eyes that watched them with growing determination and an old warrior's careful assessment of the situation. From his hidden position, Chaza had heard every word of Greer's performance. He'd seen the naked fear in Clara's face and the desperate courage burning in Elsie's stance. Most importantly, he'd recognized the lie for what it truly was. Not just cruelty for its own sake, but something far more sinister and profitable. Whispers had reached his ears over the months about children who disappeared from Dead Crow's Hollow. Now he understood that Greer's talk of Christian families and proper arrangements was nothing more than a merchant's pleasant euphemism for something unspeakable. The warrior who'd once been a father slowly clenched his scarred hands and made a choice that would either save these children or damn them all. These innocents would not vanish into darkness, as his daughter had torn from life by men who saw violence as a solution to every problem. Not while breath remained in his body. Not this time. By noon, Greer's bloodhounds had caught the scent. Elsie heard the boots' first heavy, deliberate footsteps that spoke of men who'd hunted human prey often enough to develop a rhythm for it. She pressed Clara deeper into the shadows behind the ore cart, but it was already too late. A massive shadow rounded the corner of a rusted steam engine, blocking their escape route with shoulders that seemed to fill the entire space between abandoned equipment. Jacko Murdoch was Greer's enforcer, a mountain of a man who stood nearly 7 feet tall with arms thick as tree trunks and a face that bore the accumulated scars of countless violent encounters. His left ear was gone, entirely sliced off in a Denver knife fight 3 years ago, and a jagged lightning bolt scar ran from his right temple to his jaw. But it was his eyes that truly frightened people, flat, emotionless things that looked at other human beings and the way a butcher might regard sides of beef. "Come along now, little sparrows." He rumbled, his voice like gravel grinding in the bottom of a tin bucket. Mr. Greer's waiting, and patience ain't exactly one of his better virtues. Elsie stepped protectively in front of Clara, though she barely reached Jacko's belt buckle. "We didn't steal anything, you hear me? That ring belonged to our mother. Her own dear mother gave it to her when she married our papa." Jacko's laugh was ugly as a coyote's howl over a fresh kill. "Don't much matter what you say, little girl. What matters is what Mr. Greer says. And he says you're thieves, which makes you thieves in the eyes of everyone who matters in this town. Let us go." Elsie demanded, surprised by the steel she heard in her own voice. "We'll leave town right now today. You'll never see hide nor hair of us again, I swear it." "Oh, you'll be leaving town, all right." Jacko took a deliberate step forward, and Elsie caught something dark and anticipatory in his expression. Not just cruelty, but the particular kind of pleasure a cat takes in playing with wounded mice before the final kill. Just not quite the way you're thinking, quite the way you're... Clara whimpered and clutched desperately at her sister's torn dress. Elsie felt the familiar surge of protective fury that had kept them alive through 6 months of hardship and casual cruelty, the same burning determination that had driven their mother to stand between them and their father's drunken rages, the same fire that had led their father to keep digging. Even when the mine owners told him his claim was worthless. "Run, Clara," she whispered through clenched teeth. "Run as fast as you can." Then she launched herself at Jacko's legs with all the desperate strength her small body could muster. It was like attacking a mountain made of muscle and bone. Jacko barely staggered as Elsie's tiny fists hammered against his shins, but her suicidal assault bought Clara precious seconds to react. The younger girl darted left, seeking another gap in the maze of equipment. But Jacko's massive hands shot out with surprising speed and caught her thin arm. "Got you, little rabbit." Clara cried out in pain and terror as he lifted her completely off the ground, but the sound was quickly muffled when Jacko's other hand clamped over her mouth like a steel trap. Elsie redoubled her attack, kicking and clawing with desperate fury, but Jacko simply reached down and grabbed her by the back of her dress, hauling her up like a sack of grain. "Enough games for one day," he growled, tucking both girls under his arms as if they weighed no more than bundles of kindling. "Time to go see your new home." He carried them through the camp like hunting trophies, their frantic struggles completely useless against his overwhelming strength. People watched from doorways and windows, but not a single soul moved to help. In Dead Crow's Hollow, interfering with Silas Greer's business was a luxury that few could afford, and those who could afford it had learned better long ago. The old stable sat at the camp's northern edge, a weathered building that had once housed the horses for the original mining operation, before Greer had consolidated his power and eliminated the competition. Now it served much darker purposes. Jacko kicked open the heavy wooden door and stepped into shadows that reeked of hay fear and the unwashed bodies of desperate children. Elsie's heart sank like a stone thrown into deep water as her eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through grimy windows. They were not alone. 6 other children huddled in the straw-covered stalls that lined both sides of the building, and their ages ranging from perhaps 5 years old to 14. She recognized some of them: Tommy Brennan, whose father had died in a mining accident just 3 weeks ago, leaving the boy with no relatives and no prospects; Mary Santos, whose Mexican parents had been run out of town on trumped-up charges of horse theft. Others were strangers, but all bore the same hollow-eyed look of prey animals who'd been trapped in a predator's den. Jacko dumped the Murphy sisters into an empty stall and slammed the gate shut with theatrical finality. The lock was new and solid, clearly designed to keep small hands from working it open. "Or make yourselves real comfortable, children." He sneered, his scarred face twisted into what might have been meant as a smile. "You'll all be moving on to better things real soon now." Tonight, as a matter of fact. When his heavy footsteps had faded away, the stable fell into the kind of tense silence that comes before storms. Finally, Tommy Brennan spoke from the stall next to theirs, his 14-year-old voice carrying the flat, emotionless tone of someone who'd already accepted whatever fate awaited him. "How long have you been here?" Elsie asked quietly, settling Clara against her side and trying to project more confidence than she actually felt. 2 days now." Tommy replied, his young face already bearing lines that shouldn't appear for decades. "They brought Mary in yesterday morning. The little ones..." He gestured toward 2 boys, who couldn't have been older than Clara, and their faces streaked with tears and dirt like primitive war paint. "They came just a few hours before you did." Elsie looked around the stable, taking inventory of their fellow prisoners with the calculating eye her father had taught her to use when assessing a mining claim. "What happens to us? Do you know?" "Can't say for certain," Tommy said, but his voice suggested he had suspicions he didn't want to voice. "But I heard Jacko talking to someone outside earlier. Said we'd all be delivered tonight to people who were waiting. Said there were folks who'd pay good money for workers who couldn't complain to nobody about their treatment. The word workers hung in the air, like smoke from a funeral pyre. Elsie had heard stories from other mining camps, children sold to factories in distant cities where they'd work 16-hour days until their bodies gave out, or worse still, to men whose appetites ran to things that made decent people physically sick to contemplate. Once you disappeared from a place like Dead Crow's Hollow, you might as well have fallen off the edge of the world. Clara pressed closer to her sister's side, and Elsie wrapped her arms around the younger girl's trembling shoulders. Despite the hopelessness of their situation, she felt a strange kind of calm settle over her like a warm blanket. They were trapped, outnumbered, and facing horrors she could barely imagine. But they were together, and they were not giving up. "Listen to me, all of you," she said quietly, addressing the other children with the authority of someone far older than her 10 years. "Whatever they've got planned for us, we don't make it easy. We stick together, we watch for our chances, and we fight when we have to fight." Mary Santos looked up from the corner where she'd been sitting with her knees drawn up to her chest, her dark eyes bright with unshed tears. "Fight? How did you see the size of that monster? Jacko's twice as big as all of us put together, and that's just one of them." "I don't know exactly how yet," Elsie admitted with the brutal honesty her father had always insisted upon. "But my papa always told me that being small doesn't mean being helpless. Sometimes the little fellow wins because nobody expects him to fight back at all." One of the youngest boys began to cry, quiet, hopeless sobs that spoke of a child's worst fears being made manifest in the real world. Without hesitation, Clara moved to him, gathering him into her arms with the gentle words their mother had once used to comfort them during thunderstorms and bad dreams. As afternoon shadows lengthened through the stable's grimy windows, Elsie began to plan with the methodical patience her father had taught her. She studied the walls, the gates, the patterns of Jacko's patrols. She whispered quiet encouragement to the other children and shared what little knowledge she possessed about surviving in a world that seemed determined to crush anyone too weak to fight back. But deep in her heart, she knew the terrible truth. 8 children, even brave ones, against grown men with guns and no conscience whatsoever, was not a fight they could win through strength or cleverness alone. They would need help from the outside world, the kind of help that seemed increasingly unlikely in a place where decent people had learned to keep their heads down and their mouths firmly shut. What she didn't know was that help was already watching from the shadows, planning and preparing with the patience of an experienced hunter. In the darkness beyond the stable walls, a man with ancient eyes and deadly skills was making his own plans. Plans that would either save them all or see them die in the attempt. The warrior who'd failed to save his own daughter would not fail again. Night fell over Dead Crow's Hollow, like a funeral shroud, bringing with it the first bitter whispers of winter wind from the distant mountains. Inside the stable, the children huddled together for what little warmth their bodies could provide, their empty stomachs cramping with a hunger that had become as familiar as their own heartbeats. Elsie counted the passing hours by watching moonlight creep across the rough wooden floor, knowing with sick certainty that their time was running out like sand through cupped fingers. It was well past midnight when she first heard the soft, deliberate scraping of metal against wood. The sound came from the stable's back wall, where weather and time had warped the boards enough to create small gaps between them. Elsie touched Clara's shoulder in silent warning, then crept carefully toward the noise. Through a space between the planks, she glimpsed a shadow that moved with purpose rather than the random wandering of some nocturnal animal. "Children," came a voice barely louder than the wind in the eaves. "Stay calm and quiet. I'm here to help you." The shadow resolved itself into a man's face. Weathered features that spoke of years spent under harsh sun and bitter cold dark eyes that reflected the starlight like pools of still water, and something in his expression that suggested understanding rather than threat. Elsie had seen him around town, occasionally doing odd jobs and keeping largely to himself. Who are you? She breathed, barely daring to hope. My name is Chaza, came the quiet reply. I've been watching your situation, waiting for the right moment to act. His hands worked at the loose boards with careful precision, prying them apart just enough to create a gap. There's food here. Take only what you need and eat as quietly as you can manage. He passed small bundles through the opening, bread, wrapped in clean cloth strips of dried meat that must have cost precious coins, even a few apples that looked impossibly fresh and sweet. The children fell upon the food with desperate gratitude, but Elsie noticed how Chaza's eyes never stopped moving, constantly scanning for any sign of danger. Why are you helping us? She asked between careful bites of bread that tasted better than anything she'd eaten in months. Something painful flickered across his weathered features, the kind of expression that comes from old wounds that never quite heal. Because someone should have helped my daughter when she needed it most. The simple words carried a weight of loss and regret that Elsie understood instinctively. She'd seen that same haunted look in her own reflection when she caught glimpses of herself in store windows or still puddles. What's going to happen to us? She asked, though part of her dreaded the answer. Chaza's expression hardened like iron cooling in a blacksmith's forge. Nothing good if Greer has his way. But I've been listening carefully, learning what I can. Tomorrow night they plan to move all of you to a meeting place by the old Devil's Bridge. There will be men waiting there, men who make their living trading in things that should never be bought or sold. Fear crawled up Elsie's spine like ice water, but she forced herself to remain calm and think clearly. Can you get us out of here? Not by myself, I can't. But I'm not working alone anymore. He glanced toward the front of the stable where Jacko's snores drifted from his guard post near the main doors. There are others in this town who've stayed quiet far too long. Tomorrow night that's going to change. As if summoned by his words, another shadow appeared, smaller and more obviously feminine, carrying something that rustled like paper in the night breeze. Maureen O'Brien's face emerged from the darkness, her Irish features set with the kind of determination that could move mountains when properly focused. Sweet Mother of God, she whispered when she saw the children's gaunt faces in the moonlight. Look what those bastards have done to you poor lambs. She passed additional food through the gap, along with bundles of warm clothing that smelled like soap and kindness. But it was what she showed Elsie next that truly changed everything. I found this among your mother's belongings, Maureen said, holding up a letter sealed with red wax. Bridget gave it to me just before she passed, made me promise to keep it safe and hidden. She said if anything terrible ever happened to you girls, I should read it very carefully. Elsie's hands trembled as she accepted the letter. Even in the dim moonlight, she could recognize her mother's careful handwriting on the outside. For my daughters, when the truth can no longer be hidden. What does it say? Clara whispered, pressing close to her sister's side. Maureen's voice carried the grim weight of winter storms when she replied. It says your father found something important in that mine shaft before Greer cheated him out of it. Something that made certain powerful people very nervous indeed. And it named specific names, including Preacher Winthrop. The children gasped in unison. Preacher Winthrop was considered a pillar of the community, a man who delivered stirring sermons about Christian charity and the moral obligations of civilized people. If their mother's letter somehow implicated him in their parents' deaths, that's why Greer wanted you both gone so quickly. Maureen continued, her Irish temper beginning to flare in her green eyes like flames in a hearth. Not just because you're orphans who might become burdens on the community, but because you might eventually start asking uncomfortable questions about what really happened to Seamus and Bridget Murphy. Chaza's face had transformed into something carved from ancient stone. How many people know about this letter's existence? Just the three of us for the moment. But come tomorrow morning, that's going to change dramatically. Maureen's voice carried the promise of retribution that had made her Irish ancestors feared across 2 continents. I've been quiet far too long standing by and watching children disappear while decent folk look the other way, because it's easier than standing up to bullies. No more of that. Through the gap in the boards, she pressed additional items into Elsie's eager hands, a knife with a sharp, well-maintained blade, matches wrapped carefully in oiled cloth to keep them dry, and a small leather pouch that clinked with the sound of coins. If something goes wrong tomorrow night, Maureen said, her voice deadly serious, you grab your sister and the smallest children and you run. Follow the creek north until you reach the widow Peterson's place. She lost her own little ones to the fever last winter and might be willing to take you in. What about the others? Elsie asked, gesturing toward Tommy and the remaining children who were watching this exchange with growing hope. We'll get every last one of you out safely. Chaza promised, and something in his tone suggested he'd made similar promises before and kept them. But I need you to be ready for anything. When the moment comes for action, don't hesitate even for an instant. Don't look back. Just run like your lives depend on it. A sound from the front of the stable made them all freeze, Jacko stirring restlessly in his sleep and muttering something unintelligible that might have been either a curse or prayer. For several long seconds they all held their breath, but the enforcer settled back into his drunken slumber without waking fully. We have to go now, Maureen whispered urgently. But we'll be back tomorrow night. When they try to move you to that bridge, we'll be ready and waiting. As the two adults melted back into the shadows, like ghosts returning to whatever realm spawned them, Elsie quietly distributed the food and supplies among all the children. Hope was a dangerous luxury in a place like Dead Crow's Hollow, but she felt it growing in her chest, like a small flame struggling against hurricane winds. What if they're lying to us? Mary Santos asked quietly from her corner. What if this is just another kind of trick to make us cooperate? Elsie thought about Chaza's eyes and the way they'd reflected her own loss back at her with perfect understanding. She thought about Maureen's Irish fury, the kind of righteous anger that could topple mountains when properly focused and directed. Then we'll still fight them, she said simply. Because that's what you do when you're backed into a corner with nowhere left to run. You fight until you can't fight anymore, and then you fight some more. Clara curled up against her sister's side, finally allowing herself to sleep peacefully for the first time in days. Around them, the other children settled into uneasy rest, their stomachs full for the first time in recent memory, and their hearts carrying the first fragile seeds of hope. The hope they'd felt since their world had collapsed. But Elsie remained awake, her mother's letter pressed against her heart like a talisman, and the knife hidden carefully in the folds of her dress. Tomorrow would bring either freedom or death, but it would not bring surrender. Outside the stable, the wind picked up significantly, carrying with it the sense of approaching rain and the promise of change written in storm clouds that were gathering ominously over the distant mountain peaks. The next morning dawned cold and gray, with massive storm clouds building over the distant peaks like dark armies preparing for the final battle. Elsie woke to the sound of urgent voices outside the stable, not Jacko's usual grumbling complaints, but something sharper and more anxious that spoke of plans gone awry. Through the gaps in the weathered walls, she could see men hurrying back and forth across the camp's main street with the frantic energy of ants whose hill had been kicked. Something significant had happened during the night, something that had stirred Dead Crow's Hollow like a stick thrust into a wasp's nest. The truth came crashing through the stable doors with Jacko's massive frame. The enforcer's scarred face was darker than usual, and his movements carried the dangerous tension of a man whose carefully laid plans had suddenly begun to unravel. Up, all of you, he snarled, yanking open the stall gates with unnecessary violence that spoke of barely controlled rage. Things have changed, and changed fast. As the children stumbled to their feet, blinking painfully in the harsh morning light that streamed through the open doors, Jacko grabbed Tommy Brennan by the front of his shirt and hauled the boy close enough to smell the whiskey and violence on his breath. Your friend the widow woman's been real busy overnight," he growled, shaking Tommy like a rag doll. "Seems she's been telling interesting tales all over town, got people asking questions they got no business asking about things that don't concern them." Elsie's heart leaped with desperate hope. Maureen had clearly kept her promise. Whatever she'd done was working, stirring up enough trouble to make Greer's organization nervous. But Jacko's next words crushed that fragile hope like a boot heel grinding glass into powder. "Don't matter none, though," he continued with cruel satisfaction. "Mr. Greer's decided to move up the schedule considerably. You'll all be leaving this very day soon as the sun sets proper. And this time, there won't be any rescue attempts from do-gooders who don't understand the natural order of things." He shoved Tommy back toward the other children with enough force to send the boy sprawling in the straw. Jacko's scarred face was twisted into an expression of malicious pleasure as he prepared to deliver what he clearly considered his master stroke. "That letter your precious mama wrote," he said, pulling a folded piece of paper from his shirt pocket with theatrical slowness. "The one that widow's been waving around town like it means something important. Well, let me tell you children exactly what your sainted mother really had to say." Elsie felt the world tilt beneath her feet, like a ship in a storm. How could Jacko possibly know about the letter Maureen had sworn that only the three of them knew of its existence? "See, your papa wasn't quite the saint you thought he was." Jacko continued, his voice dropping to a malicious whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting. "That mine, he was working so hard. He was stealing gold from it, skimming off the top and selling it secretly to buy whiskey and time with loose women. When Mr. Greer finally discovered the theft, well, accidents have a way of happening to dishonest men." "You're lying," Elsie said, but her voice sounded small and uncertain, even to her own ears. Jacko's laugh was like the sound a hyena might make over a fresh corpse. "Am I, little girl? Then perhaps you'd like to explain why your precious mama wrote a detailed confession letter admitting to helping your daddy steal that gold. Why she begged Mr. Greer to let her and you children leave town quietly before the law could catch up with the whole family." He unfolded the paper with mock ceremony, and as he held it up, Elsie could see words that made her blood turn to ice in her veins. "Forgive my husband's terrible weakness. The gold was never rightfully ours to take. I fear what will happen to my innocent daughters if the full truth of our crimes comes to light. Perhaps it would be better if they were placed with good Christian families far from this place of sin and corruption." "No," Clara whispered, pressing desperately against her sister's side. "Mama would never write such horrible things. She loved Papa with all her heart. She loved us more than life itself. But doubt was a poison more deadly than any snake's venom, and it was already spreading through Elsie's veins like liquid fire. She found herself remembering her father's late nights at the mine, the way he sometimes smelled of whiskey when he came home, the worried looks that would pass between her parents when they thought the children weren't watching. She remembered the hushed conversations that would stop abruptly whenever she or Clara entered the room. Had everything they believed about their parents been nothing but lies, built on a foundation of theft and deception? Jacko folded the letter with exaggerated care, like a man handling a precious document. "Your mama was a wise woman, I'll give her that. She knew you'd both be better off far away from here, away from the shame and scandal of what your daddy had done. Mr. Greer is simply carrying out her final wishes." The other children stared at Elsie and Clara with a mixture of pity and suspicion that cut deeper than any physical wound. If the Murphy sisters' own parents had been criminals, what did that make them? In a place like Dead Crow's Hollow, the sins of fathers and mothers could follow children to their graves and beyond. "So you can stop pretending you're something special," Jacko said, his voice returning to its normal, threatening growl. "You're nothing but the spawn of thieves and liars, and you'll be treated exactly as such." He turned to leave, then paused dramatically at the door, as if remembering something amusing. "Oh, and that Indian friend of yours, the one who's been sniffing around asking questions, Mr. Greer knows all about him too." Seems there's a substantial reward posted for a certain Lakota warrior who killed some cavalry soldiers up north. Funny how people's dark pasts have a way of catching up with them, ain't it? The door slammed shut with the finality of a coffin lid, leaving the children trapped in stunned silence that felt thick enough to cut with a knife. Elsie felt as if she'd been struck by lightning not once, but repeatedly, each revelation more devastating than the last. Her parents weren't the heroes she'd believed them to be. The man who'd offered to help them was apparently a wanted killer. And the letter that was supposed to save them had instead revealed their family's shame to the entire town. Clara was crying now. Quiet, heartbroken sobs that shook her thin shoulders like autumn leaves in a bitter wind. The other children had moved noticeably away from the Murphy sisters, leaving them isolated in their disgrace, like lepers in biblical times. Even Tommy Brennan, who'd been friendly before now, avoided meeting Elsie's eyes. "I don't believe it," Elsie said finally, her voice barely audible above the sound of wind rattling the stable's loose boards. "I don't believe any of it." But even as she spoke the words with as much conviction as she could muster, she could feel her certainty crumbling like dry leaves. If Jacko was lying about everything, how had he managed to get hold of their mother's most private letter? How did he know the specific details about Chaska's true identity? And why would he bother with such elaborate deceptions when the simple brute force had always worked perfectly well before? The hours that followed crawled by like wounded animals seeking a place to die. No food came, no water. The storm clouds overhead grew steadily darker and more threatening, mirroring the despair that had settled over the stable like a suffocating burial shroud. As evening approached with the inevitability of death itself, Elsie heard the unmistakable sound of wheels on the rutted road, a wagon moving slowly but deliberately toward the stable. Through the gaps in the walls, she could see Silas Greer himself walking alongside the vehicle, his pale eyes scanning the building like a predator surveying territory he was about to claim. This was it, the moment they'd all been dreading since their capture. But as the wagon drew closer, Elsie noticed something that made her heart skip several beats. The driver wasn't one of Greer's usual rough employees, but someone she recognized all too well. Preacher Winthrop, his black suit and white collar pristine, despite the gathering dust and the approaching storm. If the preacher was here, if he was personally involved in their transportation to whatever fate awaited them, then perhaps there was still some small hope remaining. Perhaps God had not completely abandoned them in their darkest hour. She was still clinging desperately to that fragile thread of hope when the stable doors opened wide and she saw the expression on Winthrop's pale face. Not compassion or Christian concern, but cold, calculating assessment. The look of a merchant evaluating livestock before a profitable sale. "That time to go, children," Greer announced, his voice carrying the finality of funeral bells tolling for the dead. "Your new lives are waiting, and we mustn't keep your benefactors waiting any longer than necessary." As the children were herded roughly toward the waiting wagon, like cattle being driven to slaughter, Elsie caught sight of something that made her blood freeze solid in her veins. Hanging from Preacher Winthrop's belt, glinting mockingly in the fading light, was her mother's wedding ring. The ring that had supposedly been stolen. The ring that had justified their capture and imprisonment in the first place. In that single devastating moment, Elsie understood with crushing clarity that every word from Jacko's mouth had been carefully constructed lies designed to break their spirits. But the truth, whatever it actually was, might be even worse than the elaborate fiction they'd been force-fed. The wagon lurched forward into the gathering darkness, carrying 8 terrified children toward a fate worse than death, while storm clouds massed overhead like vultures circling a battlefield strewn with corpses. The wagon lurched and swayed along the treacherous path toward Devil's Bridge, its wooden wheels seeking out every stone and pothole in the crude mountain road. 8 children huddled in the back, like cargo, their wrists bound with rough rope that chafed tender skin raw with each bump and jostle. Elsie kept Clara pressed tightly against her side, whispering wordless comfort, while her mind raced through increasingly desperate possibilities for escape. Preacher Winthrop drove the wagon with the practiced ease of a man who'd made this journey many times before his black hat pulled low against the gathering storm. Occasionally, he would glance back at his human cargo, and each time Elsie saw nothing remotely human in his pale eyes, only the cold, calculating assessment of a merchant evaluating the potential profit from his latest acquisition. Greer rode alongside on horseback, his rifle resting with casual menace across his saddle. Behind them, Jacko brought up the rear on his own mount, and the enforcer's massive frame swaying with each step like some prehistoric beast. 3 heavily armed men against 8 bound children. The odds would have been laughable if the stakes weren't literally life and death. "Where exactly are they taking us?" Mary Santos whispered, her voice barely audible over the wagon's constant creaking and the wind that moaned through the pine trees like the voices of the damned. Elsie had been wondering the same thing with growing dread. Devil's Bridge was an old stone structure that spanned a narrow but deep gorge about 5 miles from town. Built by Army engineers during the territory's early days, it had been abandoned when a safer route was discovered to the south. Now it stood like a monument to human folly, its ancient arches crumbling and its deck treacherous with loose stones that could send an unwary traveler plummeting to their death. Somewhere they won't be interrupted by curious townspeople. She replied grimly, trying to keep the fear out of her voice for Clara's sake. The wind picked up significantly as they climbed higher into the hills, carrying with it the sense of approaching rain. And something else smoke, perhaps, or the metallic taste that often preceded violent lightning storms. The storm clouds had massed overhead like gathering armies, and occasional flashes of sheet lightning illuminated the stark landscape in brief, ghostly relief. It was during one of these momentary illuminations that Elsie saw them, shadows moving with purpose through the scrub brush and scattered boulders on either side of the winding road, keeping careful pace with the wagon, but staying just beyond under the range of clear vision. At first, she thought they might be wolves or other predators drawn by the scent of fear. But the movement was too coordinated, too obviously purposeful. Someone was following them through the darkness. Her heart leaped with desperate hope, despite everything Jacko had told them. Chaza had promised to be ready, had sworn they wouldn't have to face whatever was coming alone. But the enforcer's revelations about the Lakota warrior's violent past had shaken her faith to its very foundations. Was he really a killer, wanted by federal authorities, a man whose help might be more dangerous than beneficial? And even if his intentions were good, did that make him capable of standing against the odds they would soon face? "Look up there," Clara breathed, pointing with her bound hands toward a rocky ridge that ran parallel to their route. A lone figure stood silhouetted against the lightning-filled sky, tall, motionless, watching their progress with the patience of a predator, waiting for exactly the right moment to strike. Even at this considerable distance, Elsie could feel the intensity of his gaze like heat radiating from a forge. Then another flash of lightning revealed that the ridge stood empty. "Just your imagination running wild," Tommy muttered, but his voice carried no real conviction. The wagon continued its relentless climb toward Devil's Bridge, each turn in the mountain road, bringing them closer to whatever terrible fate awaited at journey's end. Elsie tested her bonds for what felt like the 100th time, but the ropes held firm and unforgiving. Jacko clearly knew his business well tight enough to prevent any possibility of escape, loose enough to avoid cutting off circulation entirely. Dead children, after all, brought no profit to anyone. As they finally crested the last hill before their destination, the bridge came into view, like something from a nightmare. Even in the storm's flickering, uncertain light, it was an imposing and ominous sight. 3 massive stone arches spanning a gorge that dropped perhaps 60 feet to the rushing water below. The river had carved its way through solid rock over countless centuries, leaving smooth walls that offered no purchase for climbing. The bridge's deck was perhaps 20 feet wide with low stone parapets on either side that had crumbled dangerously in several places, leaving gaps that could easily swallow a careless person. But it was what waited on the bridge itself that made Elsie's blood turn to ice in her veins. 2 additional wagons sat motionless in the center span, and their canvas covers pulled tight against the wind and secured with military precision. Lanterns hung from tall poles that had been driven deep into cracks in the stone deck, casting wavering circles of yellow light that danced wildly in the gusting wind. Men moved between the vehicles with purposeful efficiency, perhaps 20 of them in total, all heavily armed with rifles and pistols, all bearing the hard-weathered look of those who had left civilized law far behind and never looked back. Sweet Mary and Joseph. Mary whispered, her face going pale as death. Look at them all. Far too many, Elsie thought, but didn't dare say aloud. Even if Chaza and Maureen had somehow managed to organize help from sympathetic townspeople, they would be vastly outnumbered by professional killers. The bridge was a perfect trap, one narrow way and one narrow way out, with a deadly drop on either side that would claim anyone who fell. Anyone foolish enough to attempt a rescue would find themselves caught in a devastating crossfire, with absolutely nowhere to run for cover. Greer spurred his horse forward, drawing alongside the wagon with obvious satisfaction. Almost there, children. Time to meet your new employers. Employers. Elsie couldn't keep the desperate question locked inside. Greer's smile was all predatory teeth and no warmth whatsoever, like a wolf baring its fangs before the kill. Oh yes, you'll be working hard indeed. Some of you will find employment in the silver mines down in Mexico, where the veins run deep and the overseers never ask inconvenient questions about papers or ages. Others. His gaze lingered with obvious calculation on Clara and the youngest children. Well, there are certain men with very particular tastes, who are willing to pay premium prices for exactly the right kind of companionship. The wagon lurched to a complete stop at the bridge's entrance, the horses snorting and stamping nervously as if they could sense the evil that permeated this place. Ahead of them, Elsie could see the waiting men more clearly now, a rough collection of outlaws and desperados, their clothes travel-stained and their weapons showing the kind of wear that came from frequent use. But it was their faces that truly terrified her. These weren't men driven to crime by desperation or circumstances beyond their control. These were predators who had chosen their path with full knowledge of its moral consequences. "The Winthrop," called a voice from among the assembled group. "You're later than we agreed." The preacher climbed down from the driver's seat with practiced ease, brushing road dust from his black coat, as if appearance still mattered in this place of damnation. Had to wait for the storm to provide adequate cover. Wouldn't do to have witnesses who might later cause complications. A man emerged from the group of waiting figures, tall, clean-shaven, wearing an expensive suit that marked him as fundamentally different from his rough companions. When he spoke, his accent carried the educated, cultured tones of the East Coast elite. "Mr. Caldwell, I presume?" Greer said, dismounting with obvious deference. "Indeed I am. And you must be the famous Silas Greer. I've heard quite a lot about your remarkably efficient methods." They shook hands like businessmen concluding a routine commercial transaction, which Elsie realized with growing horror was exactly what this was to them. 8 children, exactly as promised. Greer announced with the pride of a man delivering superior goods. Ages ranging from 5 to 14, all healthy, all completely isolated from any family connections that might later prove troublesome. Caldwell walked slowly to the back of the wagon, studying his potential purchases with the cold, appraising eye of a livestock dealer evaluating breeding stock. His gaze lingered on each child, making mental calculations that had absolutely nothing to do with their humanity. "The Murphy girls," he said finally, pointing directly at Elsie and Clara with one manicured finger. I've heard some very interesting stories about these two in particular. Their parents caused certain difficulties before they died. Greer acknowledged with a dismissive shrug. But the children themselves are clean slates now. No one left alive to ask uncomfortable questions about where they might have gone. Perfect. Caldwell's smile was somehow worse than Greer's polished, civilized, and utterly devoid of any trace of human mercy. My clients in San Francisco have very specific requirements for their domestic staff. These two should satisfy their needs admirably. San Francisco. The words hit Elsie like physical blows to her chest. Once they were transported that far from home, they might as well be on the dark side of the moon. No one would ever find them. No one would even think to look. Thunder rolled across the storm-darkened sky, temporarily drowning out the men's casual discussion of human trafficking. But in the brief silence that followed, Elsie heard something else entirely, a sound, like wind moving through tall grass, barely audible, but somehow wrong for the barren, rocky landscape surrounding the bridge. She wasn't the only one who noticed. One of Caldwell's men had turned sharply toward the gorge's rim, his hand moving instinctively to the pistol at his hip. "You hear that, boss?" Caldwell paused in his inspection of the children, head tilted slightly as he listened intently. For a long moment, the only sounds were the wind moaning through the bridge's stone arches and the distant rumble of approaching thunder. Then it came again, a low, haunting whistle that seemed to echo from the rocks themselves like the call of some impossible night bird. But Elsie knew with absolute certainty that it wasn't any bird. She had heard that exact same whistle 6 months ago when her father had taught her the complex signals that miners use to communicate in the dangerous depths of the earth. Someone was out there in the darkness beyond the lantern light, and they were letting the children know they weren't forgotten. Probably nothing but the wind playing tricks. Caldwell said, but his voice carried a distinct note of uncertainty. Jacko had heard the whistle too, and his combat instincts were clearly on high alert. The massive enforcer was scanning the gorge's rim with professional paranoia, his rifle now held ready across his broad chest. "Maybe we should finish this business quickly," he suggested with uncharacteristic caution. "I quite agree." Caldwell turned back to the wagon with renewed purpose. "Unload them immediately. My men will handle the final transfer arrangements." As rough hands reached eagerly for the terrified children, Elsie managed to make eye contact with each of her fellow prisoners in turn. Tommy gave her the smallest possible nod of understanding. Mary's jaw was set with grim determination. Even the youngest children seemed to grasp that whatever was about to happen, they would face it together as a family of choice, if not of blood. The mysterious whistle came again, noticeably closer this time, followed immediately by an answering call from the opposite side of the gorge. Caldwell's men were definitely nervous now, weapons drawn and eyes searching frantically through the dancing shadows cast by the wildly swinging lanterns. "It's nothing," Greer insisted, but his voice suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. That was when the first arrow, fired from the darkness with deadly precision, took him squarely in the shoulder. The arrow sprouted from Greer's shoulder like some deadly, impossible flower, its raven-black fletching quivering with the force of impact. The camp boss roared in pain, and fury, his free hand instinctively clamping over the wound, as bright red blood began seeping between his fingers like water from a cracked dam. "Ambush!" Jacko bellowed, his voice carrying clearly over the wind as he raised his rifle toward the gorge's rim. "We're under attack." Chaos erupted across Devil's Bridge like a bomb exploding in a powder magazine. Caldwell's men scattered desperately for cover behind their wagons, their weapons spitting tongues of orange fire into the storm-darkened night. Muzzle flashes lit the ancient stone deck like captured lightning, and the thunder of gunfire echoed off the gorge walls in a deafening, continuous roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. But their attackers were like ghosts in the darkness, invisible targets that seemed to melt away like morning mist before bullets could find them, Another arrow sang through the night air with a sound like death itself, and this one catching one of Caldwell's men in the upper thigh. He went down screaming in agony, his rifle clattering uselessly across the stone as he clutched at the wooden shaft protruding from his leg. "Get the children to cover!" Caldwell shouted, his carefully maintained veneer of civilized calm finally cracking under the pressure of real combat. "Don't let them escape." Jacko lunged toward the wagon with predatory speed, but Elsie was ready for him. The knife that Maureen had given her sliced through the ropes binding her wrists in one desperate, perfectly timed motion. As the enforcer's massive hands reached hungrily for Clara, Elsie drove the blade deep into his muscular forearm with all the strength her small body could muster. Jacko's howl of pain and rage was completely lost in the surrounding cacophony of gunfire. He backhanded Elsie viciously with his uninjured arm, sending her sprawling across the wagon bed, hard enough to knock the breath from her lungs, but the crucial damage had already been done. The other children were cutting themselves free with pieces of broken rope and sharp stones, their small hands working with desperate efficiency. "Run!" Elsie gasped, tasting blood where her lip had split against her teeth. "Get to the far side of the bridge." The children spilled from the wagon like water bursting from a dam, moving with the desperate speed that only mortal terror can provide. Tommy grabbed one of the younger boys under his arm, half carrying and half dragging him toward the bridge's far end. Mary Santos dove behind a section of stone parapet, just as bullets began whining overhead like angry hornets. But Clara hesitated for a crucial moment, torn between her own safety and her desperate desire to stay with her sister. "Go!" Elsie shoved Clara toward relative safety, just as Jacko's uninjured hand closed around her ankle like a steel trap. "A little bitch cut me deep," he snarled, hauling her back toward him despite her frantic struggles. Blood from his wounded arm dripped steadily onto her face as he raised his massive fist. "Now you're gonna pay for that mistake." The killing blow never landed. A figure dropped from the stone parapet above, like an avenging angel landing squarely on Jacko's broad back, with the silent grace of a hunting cat. Steel flashed wickedly in the swinging lantern light, not a white man's knife, but a traditional Lakota war blade, curved and deadly as a slice of midnight. Chaza. The warrior's sudden appearance seemed to bring the fury of the storm itself down upon the bridge. Wind howled through the gorge like the voices of angry spirits, and the first fat raindrops began to fall, making the stone deck treacherously slippery. But Chaza moved with the fluid, deadly grace of a man who had been born for violence, each motion perfectly controlled and economical. Jacko was far from helpless in a fight his size, and brutal experience had served him well in countless brawls across the frontier. But he was accustomed to overpowering smaller opponents through sheer brute strength and intimidation. Against Chaza's lightning speed and hard-earned warrior skills, his massive size became more liability than advantage. The Lakota's curved blade found the gaps in the enforcer's defenses again and again, never quite delivering a killing blow, but steadily weakening the bigger man, with each precisely placed cut. "Kill him!" Greer screamed from behind his improvised cover, still clutching his arrow-pierced shoulder. "Kill them all before they can escape." But Caldwell's hired guns were rapidly discovering that their enemies had chosen this particular battleground with tactical genius. The bridge's narrow confines severely limited their fields of fire, and the ancient stone parapets provided excellent cover for attackers as well as defenders. More figures had appeared along the gorge's rim, not many, perhaps 6 or 7 in total. But they moved with the coordinated precision that spoke of military training and careful planning. One of them was unmistakably Maureen O'Brien, her flame-red hair whipping wildly in the wind as she reloaded an ancient but well-maintained shotgun. Beside her stood men that Elsie recognized from Dead Crow's Hollow: Samuel the blacksmith, 2 grizzled miners who had lost their claims to Greer's legal machinations, and even young Danny Murphy from the saloon. His boyish face transformed by grim determination into something far older than his 16 years. They weren't professional soldiers or experienced gunfighters. They were simply ordinary people who had finally found something worth risking their lives to protect. The children. Maureen's voice somehow carried clearly over the chaos of battle. Get the children to safety. But escape was proving far more complicated than anyone had anticipated. Caldwell's men still controlled the bridge's far end with disciplined firepower, while Greer's remaining enforcers had managed to block the route back toward town. The children found themselves trapped in the center of the span, caught between two forces that cared nothing for their lives, except as valuable commodities. It was Clara who spotted the solution, first her sharp young eyes catching what the adults had missed in their focus on the immediate battle. "The ropes!" she shouted, pointing toward the thick hemp lines that secured the canvas covers on Caldwell's wagons. "We can climb down into the gorge." Elsie's heart lurched sickeningly as she grasped what her sister was suggesting. The gorge was at least 60 feet deep, its walls consisting of smooth stone carved by centuries of flowing water. Even with ropes to assist them, the descent would be incredibly dangerous for children their age. But staying on the bridge meant certain death or something far worse. "Do it," she decided without hesitation. Tommy Brennan was already moving toward the wagons, his experience as a miner's son serving him well. He worked quickly to unknot the hemp from its securing posts, testing the rope's strength with several sharp tugs that could have meant the difference between life and death. "It'll hold our weight," he announced grimly. "But probably not for very long, and definitely not for everyone at once." The youngest children would have to descend first. They weighed less, and had the best chance of making the terrifying journey safely. Mary Santos helped them over the crumbling parapet, whispering words of encouragement as they began their nightmarish descent into the storm-lashed darkness below. Meanwhile, the battle continued to rage with increasing intensity around them. Chaza and Jacko circled each other like wolves, competing for the same territory, both men now bleeding from multiple wounds, but neither willing to concede defeat. The Lakota warrior was clearly faster and more skilled, but the enforcer's sheer size and brutal experience were beginning to take their toll. A lucky swing of Jacko's massive fist caught Chaza across the temple, staggering him backward toward the edge of the parapet. "Now you die, you murdering red devil!" Jacko snarled, raising his knife for what he clearly intended as the killing blow. But at that precise moment, the bridge itself chose to intervene in the most dramatic way possible. The ancient structure had stood for more than 20 years, weathering countless storms and the gradual erosion that came with the passage of time. But it had never been designed to withstand a running gun battle, and the centuries-old mortar that held its stones together had been weakened by decades of freezing winters and scorching summers. A significant section of the western parapet chose that exact moment to collapse, with a sound like the world ending. Jacko's triumphant roar transformed instantly into a scream of pure terror as the stones beneath his feet gave way without warning. He plummeted toward the churning darkness of the gorge below his massive frame, windmilling desperately through empty air in search of purchase that would never come. His scream cut off with horrible abruptness when he struck the rocks at the bottom. But his catastrophic fall had taken a significant portion of the bridge structure with it. A jagged gap now yawned in the deck, perhaps 10 feet wide, separating the children from their planned escape route. Even worse, the collapse had damaged the supports that anchored their improvised rope bridge to the remaining stonework. "It won't hold much longer," Tommy shouted over the howling wind, his voice barely audible above the continuing gunfire. 4 of the children had already made the descent safely, the youngest ones, whose light weight had allowed them to climb down quickly before the rope could fail. But Clara, Mary, and Tommy himself still remained on the bridge, along with Elsie. And the hemp rope was already beginning to fray dangerously where it rubbed against the sharp edges of broken stone. Greer, maddened by pain from his arrow wound and the complete collapse of his carefully laid plans, struggled to his feet and raised his rifle toward the remaining children with shaking hands. "If I can't sell you, then by God, I'll see you all dead." The rifle shot rang out just as Clara began her desperate descent. The bullet struck sparks from the stone inches from her head, and she lost her grip in shock and terror. for one heart-stopping moment that seemed to last forever. She dangled by one small hand over the yawning abyss, her feet scrabbling frantically for purchase on the smooth hemp rope. Elsie didn't think or plan or hesitate. She simply moved, grabbing the rope and swinging out over the void to reach her sister. Her added weight made the already strained hemp creak ominously, but it held just long enough for her to wrap her arms securely around Clara's waist. "Together," she whispered fiercely in her sister's ear. "Like always, no matter what happens." They descended hand over hand, and their palms burning from the rough rope and their shoulders screaming in protest with each foot of progress. Above them, the gunfire was reaching a final desperate crescendo as Maureen's improvised militia pressed their attack with everything they had. Below them, the sound of rushing water grew steadily louder with each passing second. They were perhaps 20 feet from the rocky bottom when the rope finally snapped under the strain. The fall seemed to last both forever and no time at all. Elsie managed to twist her body at the last instant, taking the full impact on her back and left shoulder as they struck the shallow stream that ran along the gorge's floor. Pain exploded through her arm like liquid fire, and she felt something important give way with a wet, nauseating pop that spoke of torn ligaments or broken bones. But Clara was alive and conscious, bruised and shaken, but essentially unharmed. "Elsie." Clara's voice was small and frightened as she crouched beside her sister. "Your arm. There's something wrong with your arm." Elsie looked down and immediately wished she hadn't. Her left arm hung at an unnatural angle that made her stomach lurch, and waves of sickness swept over her in nauseating pulses. But they were alive, and they were together, and that was literally all that mattered in this moment. Above them, the battle for Devil's Bridge was reaching its final climactic phase. She could hear Greer screaming incoherent orders, Caldwell shouting for his men to retreat while they still could. And over it all, the ominous sound of ancient stone cracking under pressures it was never meant to bear. The bridge was finally coming apart after decades of patient endurance. "We have to move," Elsie said through gritted teeth, forcing herself to stand despite the agony. "Find the others before this whole place comes down." They stumbled along the rocky stream bed, calling softly for the children who had descended before them. One by one, young voices answered from the darkness, frightened and hurt, but alive, all of them, miraculously alive. As they huddled together for warmth and comfort in the shelter of an overhanging boulder, the storm finally broke in full fury. Rain poured down in torrential sheets, turning the gentle stream into a raging torrent and washing away the blood from their various injuries. Lightning illuminated the gorge in stark, brilliant relief, and in those brief, blinding flashes, they could see the bridge above them swaying like something alive and in terrible pain. With a sound like the very end of the world, the entire center span collapsed. Stone and timber crashed into the gorge in a thunderous avalanche, sending up massive geysers of water and debris that soaked them all to the skin. When the dust and spray finally settled, Devil's Bridge was broken forever, its remaining arches standing like ancient monuments to the folly of those who had tried to use it for evil purposes. In the sudden, profound silence that followed the destruction, they heard voices calling their names from the rim high above. Maureen's Irish accent was unmistakable, even at this distance, followed by others, Samuel the blacksmith, the loyal miners, men and women, who had finally found the courage to stand up against tyranny. And threading through it all, like a song of hope and redemption, came Chaza's voice. "Children, where are you? Answer if you can hear me." They were safe. They were free. And for the first time in what felt like years, Elsie allowed herself to believe that tomorrow might actually be better than today had been. Dawn came slowly to the shattered gorge, filtered through storm clouds that were finally beginning to break apart after their night of fury. Shafts of golden sunlight painted the remaining arches of Devil's Bridge in warm, almost hopeful hues, but the central span lay in ruins at the canyon's bottom, its massive stones scattered like broken teeth across the stream bed. Elsie sat with her back against a sun-warmed boulder, her left arm secured in a makeshift sling that Maureen had fashioned from strips of her own petticoat. The Irish woman had insisted on climbing down the treacherous, rain-slicked path to reach the children despite her 50-year-old bones and a lifelong fear of heights that made her hands shake like autumn leaves. "Hold still now, lamb," Maureen murmured with infinite gentleness, checking the improvised splint she'd constructed from pieces of driftwood and torn cloth. "Doc Henley will set it properly when we get you back to town, but this should keep things stable for now." Around them, the other rescued children were being tended to by the motley group of heroes who had risked everything to descend into the gorge. Samuel the blacksmith was carrying the youngest boy on his broad shoulders while humming an old hymn in a surprisingly melodious voice. Two weather-beaten miners had fashioned stretchers from fallen branches to carry the children who were too exhausted or injured to walk. Even young Danny Murphy, barely 16 himself, still pale from his first real taste of violence, had taken charge of organizing food and water for the entire group. But it was Chaza who drew Elsie's attention most strongly. The Lakota warrior sat somewhat apart from the others, as was his natural habit, but his dark eyes never stopped their careful surveillance of the children's welfare. His face bore fresh cuts from his deadly fight with Jacko, and his shirt was torn and blood-stained, but he seemed completely unaware of his own injuries. "Go to him," Clara said softly from where she was curled up beside her sister, wrapped snugly in Maureen's spare coat. Despite everything they'd been through, her young eyes remained sharp and perceptive. "He saved our lives. You should thank him properly." Elsie struggled carefully to her feet, wincing as the movement sent fresh waves of pain through her injured arm. The walk across the boulder-strewn stream bed seemed to take forever, but finally she stood before the man who had risked everything for children he barely knew. "Why?" She asked simply the single word carrying all the weight of her confusion and gratitude. Chaza looked up at her, and for a brief moment she saw past the warrior's carefully maintained stoic mask to glimpse the grieving father underneath. "Because someone should have saved my daughter when she needed it most." "What happened to her?" Elsie asked, though part of her dreaded hearing the answer. "The cavalry came to our village 3 winters ago." He replied, his voice steady, but carrying an undertone of pain that would never fully heal. "They claimed we had been harboring hostile warriors, that we needed to be taught a lesson about the consequences of defying federal authority. My daughter was 7 years old, exactly Clara's age, when I first saw you both. She died with a bullet in her back, trying to run to her mother's arms." The simple, devastating statement hit Elsie like a physical blow. She had known loss. The death of her parents had carved a hollow space in her heart that would never be completely filled. But to lose a child, to fail to protect the most precious thing in the world, that was a kind of pain she could barely comprehend. "I'm sorry." She said the words feeling inadequate, but necessary. "What was her name?" "Winona," Chaza replied. And for the first time since she'd known him, his voice carried warmth instead of careful control. "It means firstborn daughter in my language. She would have been about your age now if she had lived." "Is that why you helped us, because we reminded you of her?" "Partly," he admitted, rising to his feet with movements that spoke of old wounds and older sorrows. "But also because it was simply the right thing to do. I've been running from my grief for too long, hiding from the world, because I failed to protect what mattered most to me. Last night, watching you fight for your sister's life, I remembered that there are still children in this world worth protecting." Around them, the rescued children were beginning the long, difficult climb out of the gorge. Makeshift ropes and the natural handholds carved into the rock face would make the ascent possible, though challenging. But they were going home, or at least to the closest thing to home they had left. "What will happen to us now?" Elsie asked, though she was almost afraid to hope for an answer. It was Maureen who replied, having approached quietly during their conversation with a silent grace that seemed to come naturally to her. "You'll come home with me, of course. All of you who need it. I've got plenty of room in the boarding house, and after last night, I don't think anyone in Dead Crow's Hollow will dare to interfere with my decisions." "What about Greer and Caldwell? What if they come back?" Maureen's expression hardened like iron cooling in winter air. "Greer's got a dislocated shoulder and considerably more humility than he's shown in years, assuming he even survived the bridge collapse. As for Caldwell and his hired killers," she gestured toward the pile of rubble that had once been the center span. "They had to retreat in quite a hurry when their escape route came down around their ears. Last anyone saw of them, they were riding east at a full gallop, and good riddance to the lot of them. Mars, but they might return someday." Chaza observed with the practical caution of a man who'd learned that enemies rarely stayed defeated forever. "Let them try." Maureen replied, her Irish temper flaring bright in her green eyes like flames in a hearth. "They'll find a town that's finally learned to stand up for itself and its children. We may not be professional soldiers, but we're not cowards anymore either. Not after what we accomplished last night." The climb out of the gorge took the better part of the morning, with children being passed carefully from hand to hand, up the steepest sections, while the adults formed human chains to ensure that no one fell. By the time they finally reached the rim, the sun was riding high overhead, and the storm clouds had given way to a crystalline blue sky that seemed to promise better days ahead. Dead Crow's Hollow spread before them in the distance, looking somehow smaller and less threatening in the clear daylight. Smoke rose peacefully from chimneys, and people were beginning to emerge from their buildings to see the returning heroes. But Elsie noticed that many more faces were appearing in windows and doorways than had been visible the night before. Word of the battle had clearly spread throughout the community, and the entire town seemed to be waiting to see what would happen next. What happened was a transformation that began immediately and grew stronger with each passing hour. It started with Mrs. Kellerman, the baker's wife, who had called them beggars and nuisances just 2 days earlier. She stepped boldly into the street as the group approached her arms, loaded with fresh bread, and her face flushed with obvious shame. "I'm sorry," she said, simply offering the food directly to the children with tears in her eyes. "I should have spoken up much sooner. We all should have found our voices before things went so far." Others quickly followed her example. The general store owner emerged with armloads of clothing and warm blankets. Doc Henley appeared with his medical bag, insisting on examining every single child despite their exhausted protests that they were essentially fine. Even some of Greer's former supporters seemed genuinely eager to distance themselves from their disgraced former leader. But it was Preacher Winthrop's conspicuous absence that spoke most loudly of how completely the balance of power had shifted. His church stood empty and abandoned, its doors locked tight and its windows dark as a tomb. According to Samuel the blacksmith, the preacher had fled town during the night, taking with him a strongbox that had contained the church's entire collection fund. "Good riddance to bad rubbish," was Maureen's characteristically tart comment. "A man who'd sell children into slavery has no business whatsoever preaching about salvation and Christian charity." As they finally reached the boarding house that would serve as sanctuary, Elsie felt a strange, almost overwhelming sensation wash over her, something she hadn't experienced in so long that it took her a moment to recognize it properly. Safety. For the first time in many months, she felt truly, completely safe. But even as that realization brought tears of relief to her eyes, she knew their ordeal wasn't entirely finished. There were still questions that needed answers, wounds both physical and emotional, that required careful healing and futures that had to be carefully planned and secured. The children who had been rescued would need far more than just food and shelter. They would need love, patience, understanding, and time to recover from traumas that went much deeper than any physical injuries. And somewhere out in the vast wilderness, men like Caldwell were still free to prey upon other innocent victims. But for now, in this precious moment, it was enough to be alive and together and truly home at last. 3 months later, as autumn painted the Dakota hills in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, Elsie stood on the front porch of Maureen's boarding house and watched Clara patiently teaching the younger children to read from one of their mother's carefully preserved books. Her sister's clear voice carried easily in the crisp air, encouraging and gentle, as she helped Tommy Brennan work through the more difficult passages. Elsie's left arm still ached whenever the weather changed, but Doc Henley had performed his work with remarkable skill. The bones had healed straight and strong, and she had gradually regained most of her strength through months of careful supervised exercise. More importantly, all of the children had managed to find their proper places in the dramatically transformed community of Dead Crow's Hollow. Mary Santos had been formally adopted by Samuel the blacksmith and his wife, who had remained childless for more than 20 years before finally opening their hearts to the fierce, determined little girl. The youngest children had been taken in by various families throughout the town, all of whom seemed genuinely grateful for the opportunity to make amends for their previous silence and inaction. Even Tommy, despite being 14 and therefore nearly a man by frontier standards, had found meaningful work as an apprentice to the town's new mine supervisor. An honest, competent man brought in from Denver to replace Greer's thoroughly corrupt operation. Silas Greer himself had vanished from Dead Crow's Hollow under circumstances that varied dramatically depending on who was telling the story. Some claimed he had fled like a coward in the middle of the night, taking whatever remained of his ill-gotten wealth. Others insisted he had been formally escorted to the territorial border by a group of heavily armed citizens who had made it crystal clear he was no longer welcome. What everyone agreed upon was that he was gone completely and permanently, and the entire community was immeasurably better for his absence. The new mine supervisor, a former Army engineer named Captain Morrison, had discovered extensive evidence of Greer's fraudulent business practices during his first week on the job. Mining claims that had been stolen through forged documents and legal trickery were systematically returned to their rightful owners or their surviving heirs. The Murphy claim, it turned out, had indeed contained a remarkably rich vein of gold wealth that now provided a modest but steady income for Elsie and Clara's future security. But perhaps the most significant change in Dead Crow's Hollow was harder to quantify in concrete terms. The town had somehow managed to find its collective conscience. Where once people had looked away when children went hungry or when the powerful preyed ruthlessly upon the weak, now there existed a carefully organized network of watchful eyes and willing hands ready to help at a moment's notice. Maureen had organized it all with her typical Irish efficiency, creating what she proudly called her Circle of Care, a dedicated group of women and men absolutely committed to ensuring that no child in their community would ever again face the world alone and unprotected. Chaza had become an integral part of that protective circle. Though he maintained his characteristically quiet, unobtrusive approach, he had moved into a small but comfortable cabin on the edge of town where he worked as a tracker and wilderness guide for legitimate mining operations and surveying expeditions. His encyclopedic knowledge of the land and its wildlife had proved invaluable to the community, and his hard-earned reputation for absolute honesty had gradually overcome whatever prejudices might have made his presence unwelcome in less enlightened times. But Elsie suspected his true value to Dead Crow's Hollow lay in something far less tangible than his practical skills. He had become the town's living reminder that courage could take many different forms, and that sometimes the most unlikely heroes emerged from among those who had lost everything and still chosen to fight for others rather than surrendering to despair. "Penny for your thoughts, lamb." Maureen's familiar voice interrupted her peaceful reverie. Elsie turned to find the Irish woman approaching with 2 steaming cups of tea, her red hair now showing distinct threads of silver, but her green eyes remaining as sharp and alert as ever. Over the past months, Maureen had evolved from simply a guardian or benefactor into something far more precious. She had become the mother that Elsie and Clara had thought they would never have again. Just thinking about how much everything has changed, Elsie replied, accepting the warm cup with genuine gratitude. Aye, that it certainly has. Maureen agreed with satisfaction. Though, perhaps it's more accurate to say that we finally became the people we should have been all along, instead of the cowards we'd allowed ourselves to become. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the children at their lessons and enjoying the crisp autumn air. But Elsie's attention was gradually drawn to a figure approaching along the main street, a woman in practical traveling clothes, dusty from a long journey, but carrying herself with unmistakable determination and purpose. "Are you expecting anyone?" Elsie asked curiously. Maureen followed her gaze and frowned slightly. "No, but she's heading directly for us. Must be looking for lodging, I suppose." As the woman drew closer, Elsie could see that she was perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair pinned back in a severe but practical style, and intelligent brown eyes that seemed to take in every detail of their surroundings. She carried a well-used leather satchel that suggested considerable travel, and her clothes, while dusty from the road, were clearly of good quality. "Excuse me," the woman called as she reached the porch steps. "I'm looking for Mrs. Maureen O'Brien." "That would be me," Maureen replied with characteristic directness. "How can I help you?" The stranger's smile transformed her entire face, making her appear years younger. "My name is Catherine Mitchell. I'm a journalist with the Denver Post, and I've traveled quite a distance to write a story about what happened here 3 months ago." Elsie felt an immediate chill of unease run down her spine. The last thing any of them needed was unwanted publicity that might somehow draw attention from people like Caldwell, who were presumably still somewhere out there in the world pursuing their evil trade. But Catherine Mitchell seemed to sense her concern immediately. "Please don't worry," she said quickly and reassuringly. "I'm not here to sensationalize your experiences or exploit your suffering for commercial gain. I'm here because what happened in Dead Crow's Hollow represents something genuinely important, living proof that ordinary people can create extraordinary changes when they finally find the courage to act on their convictions." "And what exactly would you want from us?" Maureen asked with understandable caution. "Simply the truth," Catherine replied earnestly. "The real story of how an entire community found its conscience and saved its most vulnerable members. There are other towns scattered across this territory, other places where children disappear into the darkness and decent people remain silent because they believe they can't possibly make a meaningful difference. Your story could provide them with hope and inspiration." Elsie looked toward Clara, who was still patiently teaching the younger children to read, with infinite patience and gentle encouragement. She thought about Tommy, justifiably proud of his new apprenticeship and the honest calluses he was earning through legitimate hard work. She thought about Mary flourishing under the loving care of her adoptive parents, and about all the other children who had found genuine safety and belonging in a town that had finally learned what it meant to care for its own. Perhaps their story truly did deserve to be told to a wider audience. "There's someone else you absolutely must speak with," Elsie said, finally making her decision. "Someone whose role in all of this was probably more important than anyone else's." She pointed toward the edge of town, where Chaza could be seen working methodically in his small garden, preparing for the approaching winter with the patient care of a man who understood the vital importance of thorough preparation. Catherine Mitchell's eyes followed the gesture, and she nodded with obvious understanding. "I was very much hoping you would say exactly that. A story like this wouldn't be remotely complete without hearing from all the heroes who were involved." As the journalist made her way toward Chaza's modest cabin, Elsie felt Clara's warm hand slip naturally into hers. Her sister had finished the reading lesson and come to stand beside her, their bond as strong and unbreakable as ever, despite everything they had endured together. "Do you think it's really over?" Clara asked quietly, voicing the question that had been lurking in both their minds. Elsie considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Out there in the wider world, Men like Greer and Caldwell undoubtedly still existed, still pursuing their evil trades. Children were probably still going hungry at this very moment, still facing dangers that no child should ever have to confront. Evil had not been permanently defeated, it had simply been pushed back from one small corner of the Dakota territory. But in that corner, something genuinely beautiful had taken root and was growing stronger every day. A community that actively protected its most vulnerable members. Families forged not by blood, but by deliberate choice and unconditional love. And most importantly, the hard-won knowledge that ordinary people could indeed make extraordinary differences when they found the courage to try. No, she said honestly. I don't think it's completely over. But I think we're ready for whatever comes next. As if summoned by her words, a lone rider appeared on the distant horizon, a solitary figure approaching at a steady, unhurried pace. For just a moment, Elsie felt the familiar fear stir in her chest, like a sleeping animal awakening. But as the rider drew closer, she could see it was simply a young man delivering mail, his saddlebags bulging with letters and packages from the outside world. Among those letters, as they would discover later that evening, was one that would provide the final missing piece of their family's tragic puzzle. It came from a woman in San Francisco, someone who had heard whispered stories about children, who had escaped a terrible fate, stories that had spread far beyond anything Catherine Mitchell could have imagined when she eventually published her article. But there was something else in that delivery, something that made Clara gasp aloud and call urgently for Elsie to come quickly. Hidden within the woman's letter was a second, much older document, yellowed with age and carefully preserved. A letter addressed in faded ink to Seamus and Bridget Murphy, Dead Crows, Hollow, Dakota Territory. With trembling hands, Elsie unfolded the ancient paper and read words that finally completely laid their parents' tortured ghosts to rest. My dear friends, I write to warn you that dangerous men have come asking pointed questions about your recent discovery in the mine shaft. I have grave fears that Greer knows not only about the gold vein you uncovered, but more importantly about the evidence you found regarding his other darker activities. You must take the children and leave town immediately tonight if possible. I have arranged safe passage to Denver, where my cousin can help you start completely anew. Your devoted friend, always Jonas Peterson. The letter was dated exactly 3 days before their father's fatal accident. Elsie sank heavily into a chair on the porch, Clara close beside her, both girls, finally understanding the complete scope of what their parents had faced in those final terrifying days. They hadn't been criminals or thieves. They had been heroes who had discovered Greer's child trafficking operation and paid the ultimate price for trying to expose it. They knew. Clara whispered, her voice filled with awe and fresh grief. They knew the truth, and they tried to save us. And they did save us. Elsie replied, thinking of the hidden maps and the lessons about reading rock formations and all the other knowledge their parents had passed down that had helped them survive their ordeal. Just not in the way they had originally planned. As the sun finally set behind the distant mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Elsie felt the last piece of the puzzle click satisfyingly into place. Their parents hadn't died as criminals or helpless victims. They had died as parents fighting to protect their children's future, even when they couldn't protect their own lives. But there was one final surprise waiting hidden in Maureen's apron pocket, where she had kept it safe for months. With tears in her eyes, the Irish woman pulled out their mother's wedding ring, the same ring that Jake Murphy had stolen, and that Preacher Winthrop had worn as a trophy. I took this from that bastard's body when we found him in the gorge, Maureen said, simply pressing the precious circle into Elsie's palm. I thought you might want it back where it belongs. In the boarding house that had become their true sanctuary, 8 children who had once faced the darkness alone settled down to sleep, surrounded by love, safety, and the solid promise of better tomorrows. Their mother's wedding ring caught the last rays of sunlight from its place of honor on the mantelpiece, gleaming like a symbol of enduring love. and an unbreakable reminder that some bonds could never be severed, no matter how dark the night or how fierce the storm. Outside, Chaza sat peacefully on his porch, playing a soft, haunting melody on a wooden flute. The notes carried across the town like a lullaby for the living and a prayer for the dead. It was a song his daughter had loved, a song he hadn't been able to play since her death. But tonight, surrounded by the sounds of children's laughter and the warmth of a community that had learned to care for its own, he found that he could play it again without his heart breaking. And in that music, in the laughter of saved children, and in the quiet satisfaction of justice, finally served, there was peace. The story of Dead Crow's Hollow had ended, but the stories of the children who had survived it were just beginning. And that, perhaps, was the greatest victory of all. Clara had approached Chaza's porch quietly during his evening music, carrying something small in her hands. When the last note faded into the twilight, she stepped forward and offered him a simple bracelet woven from hemp rope, part of the very rope that had saved their lives at Devil's Bridge. "For Winona," she said simply. "So you'll always remember that love doesn't end just because someone goes away." Chaza accepted the gift with hands that trembled slightly, and for the first time in 3 years, he allowed himself to smile without pain. The broken bridge still stands in the Dakota hills, its remaining arches serving as a monument to the night, when ordinary people discovered extraordinary courage. Visitors occasionally come to see the place where children were saved and a community found its soul. But the real monument isn't made of stone. It lives in the families that were formed, the lives that were transformed, and the knowledge that even in the darkest places, hope can take root and flourish. Some stories end with the final word written. Others echo forward through time, inspiring new acts of courage and new victories over darkness. The story of Dead Crow's Hollow belongs to the latter category, a reminder that no child is ever truly alone, as long as there are adults willing to remember what it means to protect the innocent. And that, in the end, is perhaps the most important story of all.